We're just excited to be able to introduce you tonight to Gary Habermas. In Germany, he's known as Gary Habermas, right? If you were to go into William Lane Craig's living room, he would be Gary Habermas. No one knows why. He is a distinguished professor of apologetics and philosophy at Liberty University. He has been working on the question of the resurrection of Jesus since the time he was 14 years old when he wrote his first essay. And he continues to work on that and work at a very high level, working with a variety of students of his and other graduate people. For example, Mike Licona, whose book is over there. You and Mike wrote together a book. What was it called? The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. That's a great book. And oh, there we go. Oh, here's my assistant. Come on. Here's my assistant. This is the book right here, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Let me see one of these big old guys. Volume 1. This is On the Resurrection Evidences. It's a great book. Over 2,000 pages, right? Oh, these two together are 2,000 pages. So, wonderful reading. And here, On the Resurrection, Refutations. These are the people who have argued against the resurrection historically, and you present their arguments, but you also present your argument as well, and refuting their arguments. Fantastic stuff, important. We're going to hear some of that tonight. We're going to be treated to some of that tonight. Now, Gary Habermas, Gary, he has debated everybody who's worth debating, and a few who weren't. But he's debated them all. And you can find those on YouTube, but some of the ones are so epic that they have been actually published in books. And we would encourage you, you can find most of those books, if not all of them, right here at the Lanier Theological Library. We're so pleased that he's come to be with us to do the 4th annual John Warwick Montgomery Lecture. Would you please welcome Dr. Gary Habermas.
This is going to be the first two-tiered lecture here, okay? I should be starting up there, but the runway is not long enough. So I'll explain this. But the main lecture tonight, up there, is 5 historical facts within the first 6 years after the crucifixion. Each one is very difficult to refute. I think the resurrection can rest on these 6 facts alone. But before I do that, I got some questions earlier about how does this compare to what's available in other religions or other philosophies or so on. So I said, well, I don't have anywhere to walk. I walk all the way across large churches. And one time, I walked out the side door that was about 100 feet down that way, and I had to make a point about one of the other books, and I opened the door and went out, and the door locked. True story. So I pounded on the door, and somebody came over and let me in, and I finished my lecture. Before I start, I'm going to start with the passage, but let me say something about John Montgomery, and this is not self-serving in any way. It's just something that touched my heart with very few things I've ever been told. But John and I have known each other for 30, 40 years. We'd have to go back and think about it. But we'd call, we'd talk, we'd write emails. I know a lot of you know him better than I did, but we had a good relationship. I've been to his home in France several times, and I called him when I heard that Lanier had died, his wife, and I called to see how he was doing, and he said, "It's been a very difficult time for me, but because it sounded so un-Montgomeryan, it made a real impact on me." And he said, during the phone call, it was a brief phone call, he said, "Gary, I wished you'd been here with me in France and could have stayed with me for a few weeks while I was going through my suffering." And I thought, from John Montgomery? That's about the world. I've never heard him talk in personal terms like that. And it just really kind of melted my heart that he was there alone having a rough time. So I think an appropriate word from him and some of the things he went through. You know, sometimes those of us, and some of them right here in the front row, the guys that do the most writing to this stuff have to go through suffering and things too. And more about that later. Now, an explanation of why I'm down here. Well, I already told you I got to walk a long way. But if you picture right here on the edge the crucifixion, I'm going to use 30 AD. I know 33 is becoming a very close competitor for the best year from scholars, New Testament scholars. It's immaterial to me. I use 30 AD. It's all going to be plus or minus from the cross, so whatever the date is doesn't make that much difference. But I use 30 AD because I use a minimal facts argument, which means I use the facts which the critical scholars allow, and they almost all use 30 AD. So that's why I'm there. But I'm going to take this and go across here, starting with 30 and ending with either 35 or 36, depending on whether Paul's conversion was +2 or +3. Everybody puts them there. It doesn't make a difference if you're conservative or liberal. 2 or 3 years after, but the total is 6 years, 30 to 36. But I came down here on the floor for another reason. I do this at the beginning of the lecture because I get a lot of questions. What about the Gospels? And I'm mostly talking about Paul up here, but I do allow the Gospels. And a guy just wrote the other day complaining about the first big book, saying, oh, he only cares about Paul, that's all he writes about. Well, I got 200 pages in there on the Gospels. So there's a lot of good data on the Gospels. But what I'd like to do, to get right into this, is to direct your attention to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And I'm going to, if I were doing the Gospels, I would start with Mark. So I'll do that down here. Then I'll go back up into the lecture proper. I'll have to go back to the cross at 30 AD. But picture this as an extension of that. I just don't want to keep getting down and up and down. I mean, sorry, David, I was here last year, and I don't want some things to happen. I want to be real careful going up and down. So let me begin. 1 Corinthians 15. Paul went to Corinth, and he said, I came to you, Corinthians, and I preached the gospel to you. And if you've trusted Christ, I'm obviously paraphrasing, if you've trusted Christ, you're saved. If not, you're not, if you've believed on him in vain. And then in verse 3, he gives the most famous creed, and I'll define creeds later, in the New Testament. And in verse 3, Paul says, he says, I delivered unto you what I also received. How that Christ, oh, by the way, he said of first importance. This is the most important thing he could share. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, buried, rose again the third day, and appeared. And in those first 3 verses, 3 to 5, he goes on to say he appeared to Peter and then the 12. And he goes on, and this is the longest list of appearances in the New Testament where they're all together, which is amazing because a lot of skeptics say, oh, the resurrection stuff is like phone tag. You start at the beginning, the story is outrageous at the end, and the story is always bigger at the end, and it's bloated and everything else. Well, explain this one then. Paul starts out with the longest list in record, and it begins. It starts at the beginning. I'll tell you later how early people think this is, and if you haven't heard this before, it's going to, well, as the old phrase goes, blow your mind. It's unbelievable how early the data is, how early the data are, because virtually everybody shares the same view, left, right, or center in theology. But a lot of people say, what do you do with the Gospels? And that's what I'm going to do is stop right here and just pretend like you've already heard this, or that the lecture's on Mark. And I'm going to say Mark is almost always said to be the earliest gospel. And here's the way critics date these books. Mark is dated at 60 to 75. By the way, a lot of critics like 70 to 75, but a study was done at Houston Christian University by one of Mike Lacona's grad students who surveyed hundreds of critical scholars. The most popular date for Mark is not 70 to 75, it's 60 to 70, and just over half of the guys surveyed said that Mark was based on Peter. Now, a lot of people think that's a really conservative conclusion, only conservatives say that, but about 52% of that group. So one thing I want to say about these Gospels is that each Gospel is based on source material that's earlier than it is. So it's not a story of these folks writing from 60 to 95, John, and putting whatever they want in there, because they used earlier sources, and that's very, very important. For Mark has a portion that the majority of critical scholars accept called the pre-Markan Passion narrative. And it looks like it's taken from about the time of Jesus' interrogation all the way up to about the time of the empty tomb. There's no appearances, but this came from a very early source. And it's starting to make some people think Mark's earlier than we always thought he was. Two agnostic scholars, both specialists in New Testament. One of them passed away in 2014, Morris Casey. He puts Mark between 37 and 40 AD. He dates Matthew, by the way, to 50 AD. Very well-known New Testament scholar. James Crossley, New Testament scholar, dates Mark to 37 AD. Now, some people go, well, come on. Crossley studied under Casey for his PhD. That's one argument, not two. Wrong. They both use different arguments for the early date of Mark. And Crossley did the separate argument for his thesis. So right away, we have a pre-Markan narrative here. Now, if we can use critical dating, Luke is going to be, Matthew's next. And Matthew's dated about 80 AD. But Matthew has a couple of sources. One is called M, and it's the text that Matthew has that nobody else has. Matthew also may or may not be connected with the Logia of Papias. Now, that's kind of a not so popular view today, but I just heard recently it's coming back. I don't know if that's true or not, the Hebrew Matthew. But so there's a couple there for Mark, and there's a third source. It's called Q. Now, a lot of times evangelicals go off on Q. They think it's a document, it's not there, and that's not what I'm calling Q. Here's a real easy definition of Q. Q are texts that Matthew and Luke have in common, and they're not in Mark. But it's another source, because why would they be citing the same verses when they're writing around the Mediterranean in different locations? So Mark, pre-Markan narrative. Here is Matthew with possibly Logia. He's got M and he's got Q. Luke is put about 85, and he's got a source that nobody else has. It's called L. And he also has Q, because two guys hold Q, Matthew and Luke. And I do this to my doctoral students. It's really, really simple, but you have to think of it this way. I'll start out a class just to see where my class is and where they are in knowledge. And I'll say, what is a source called if it's written by Mark? Duh, Mark. What's the source called if it's written by Mark and Matthew? Mark. What's a source written by Mark and Luke? Mark. What's a source that's written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Mark. If Mark is there, Mark's given the credit because he's the earliest. Then what do you call a source that's written by Matthew and Luke? That's not a Mark. Q. And if you get this whole quiz right, I know you've been in some good New Testament classes before you came into the PhD program, and you're talking about critical theology. But Luke also says that he talked to some eyewitnesses at the beginning, first 4 verses of Luke 1, a passage that's treated very seriously. He's also a companion of Paul's, so he's got some other influence there. And these 4 Gospels all have sources that go back. Some of them, by the way, that pre-Markan Passion narrative, it's often dated to the 30s AD. They can figure this out. They think the latest it could be is 37 AD, Passion narrative for Mark. John is placed at 95 AD, approximately, 90 to 100 AD. But maybe you've not heard this, but John, according to a lot of New Testament scholars, used a source called a miracle source. And it's a source, you know why? John numbered the first couple of miracles that Jesus did. And he said, this is the first miracle, this is the second miracle. And they wonder where those numbers came from. So they say, oh, he was using a source of miracles. And the Jesus Seminar even considered it as a source. Now, they voted against it. but it was serious enough for them. They're the guys that reject 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus, and they thought it was it was likely enough to vote on, although they voted it down. But they're going to vote on something in a moment that's going to make you, of the date of 1 Corinthians, it's really going to get you. Now, so, people say things like, okay, Mark's at, let me use the regular dates, 70 to 75 is normally given. Matthew's about 80, Luke's about 85, John's 95, and you often hear this from New Testament scholars. Come on, John is 60 years later. Who believes sources 60 years later? And to show you how almost unethical this is from people who know the difference, let's do some quick comparisons in the ancient world. Okay? I'm not saying we don't have any comments that are really early to sources, but how about earth-shaking ones like the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus? All right, on my shelf, I've got a book by a PhD, British professor, he's passed away now, but in a major British university, PhD, he's a Buddhist, and it's edited Buddhist scriptures. And here's what he says on his opening page. He says, for you Christians reading this book, we do not have what you have. You have the words of your Lord. We don't. You have the words of your Lord, and those who learn from them. We don't have those either. And you have the words of your Lord, those who learn from him, and those to whom they got material. We don't have that either. So you beat us by 3 shots here. In fact, you ready? In fact, we don't even know what Buddha taught. We don't know what he taught. And when you get to the chapter in the book, what did Buddha teach? He says, I already told you, we don't know. And I'm not going to, he's still speaking. He said, I'm not going to tell you the theories because the theories start wars. And we don't really know. I have the sources of Buddha here because they're beautiful reading. If they bless you, wonderful. If you don't, read it for whatever, wonderful. I just want you to know what I'm doing. I'm not competing with anybody. That's what he says. The Upanishads of the Hindu text, earliest set, 1,800 years after writing. Oh yeah, but you Christians, you have John at 95, which subtract 30. This is plus 65. That's way too late to know. We'd rather use a text from 1,800 years later. Earliest copy of the Bhagavad Gita, 4,200 years after Krishna was supposed to live. Oh, and by the way, most Krishna scholars don't think Krishna ever lived in history. Some real issues here, but especially this Buddhist one. You know what he said when he closes, says we don't have what they have? He says, my sources in this book, I think I'm using the major Buddhist scriptures, the most beautiful ones. He said the source of this book comes 600 to 800 years after Buddha died. Once again, John, that lousy source at the end of the Gospels, is plus 65. Yeah, well, we'd rather have books at 800 years after. I'm not putting anybody down. I'm saying when people go after Christianity in the Gospels, these are some of the things that we can take from the resurrection narratives. And I have the 200 pages in that first book on the Gospels. People think I don't write on them, but I only did the 5 resurrection chapters, Matthew in the Gospels, Matthew 28, Mark 16, where there's probably no appearances, Luke 24, John 20, John 21, and the first 11 verses in the book of Acts. 200 pages. Wait a minute, that's my writing manuscript. It might only be like 160 or 70, the book, I don't remember. But I do think the Gospels have a lot of data. Okay, enough about all that. Now I'm ready to start my lecture. This is 30 AD. The end of this platform is 36 AD. Could be 35, depending on whether Paul is converted at +2 or +3. And I'm using critical dates. Now, a lot of you know I use the minimal facts argument, which by definition, a minimal fact is one that has, here's the most important thing. I always get hit in the second one. It's virtually irrelevant because the second one is so far behind the first one. The first rule is I will use no fact that is not this is not multiple attestation of source. This is not what we call multiple attestation of manuscripts. This is multiple attestation of data, events, and backup. I will use no fact that not is multiply defended by critical sources. In fact, that first volume that they held up, these 6 facts, now keep in mind, I say 6 facts, it's 6 facts, but it's also the data that make the 6 facts historical. There's other data there, but they're pointing to 6 separate facts. And the sources there, I didn't know this till after I finished the book, and I went back and looked. There's 14.7 independent evidences for each of the 6 facts. Now remember, these are from the ancient world, and critics are almost always okay with using this material. That's a second rule for the minimal facts. Almost all critical scholars admit all 6. And my point's going to be, I'll give you the conclusion right up front. The conclusion is, if there are 6 facts which evidence the resurrection very clearly, and by the way, these are in 3 sets of 2 each, 2, 2, and 2. We have plenty of data to say it's the best thesis if you want to argue abductively, or if you want to argue inductively. There's a different logical strategies for data. But abductively, you first look at data, you go after it and see if there's any multiple alternative theses, and that's books 1 and 2. And then you make up a narrative of what best fills in the blank. This is a historical maneuver that's well accepted as opposed to the alternatives. Forgive me for using a German term, but Religionsgeschichte is the movement from about 1880 to 1930 where they found alternate mythology, and it was hot stuff. But they were skeptics. Then you got Bultmann in the early 20th century. He's an existentialist skeptic and was influenced by that group. This is critical history approach. It takes history very seriously. And once again, it says something like this. Get your source data, check it out. Number 2, apply critical theories and share the narrative that you come from this that we use in preaching or teaching or whatever. But it's all based on data. The first 2 views do not treat data like that. Okay, so with that, I'll start. Jesus is crucified. The crucifixion is allowed by everybody. I mean, with almost no exceptions. Bart Ehrman, the famous New Testament atheist, he gives 15 independent sources for the crucifixion. And about almost half of them are not in the New Testament. So for people who say, you got to use sources that are outside the New Testament, that's not what critical scholars say, the specialists. In fact, here's Bart Ehrman's actual argument on this. He says, a lot of people tell me I must be trusting Scripture, and they don't like that because they're mythicists. First of all, he goes, that's their name. They don't believe Jesus lived. That's not somebody saying that derogatorily. They call themselves mythicists. Jesus didn't live. And he goes off on them for 20 pages. And he makes fun of their arguments. I mean, he really does. And then he says, some of you are upset because you write your crummy books and you complain that we don't use them in our research. We don't use them because you're not scholars. Is that okay? And then he says, secondly, you think you should have a toehold, he should have a foothold in New Testament scholarship? You don't have a foothold. You don't even have a toehold. That's why we don't read your stuff. And he says, to my knowledge, the thousands of people I've met in AAR, SBL, other meetings, thousands of guys holding these positions, he says, I don't know one of them who says Jesus probably never lived. So keep your views to yourself. He goes off on their not having degrees. He does give credit to Richard Carrier and Bob Price for having good degrees, but they're mythicists. So he does say they they know their stuff. But he says, nobody hires them in universities. Now, maybe the two guys don't want to teach there. I don't know. I told the group this just today. Bob Price just wrote me the other day again. We've been friends for about 30 years. He's a myther. And you got to be ready for this. He says, hey, it's a Wednesday. He writes me on a Wednesday. Will you be my debate partner tomorrow in a live debate? Come on, who writes on Wednesday night and asks me to be a debate partner tomorrow? What in the world are you debating? We're debating the presidential candidates. Bob's position is pretty well known. He was a Trumper, but he's an atheist myther. And he wanted me to be on his side to argue about the other side. I said, Bob, I'm in the middle of this manuscript. You have to go on your own, and so on. So odd combinations here between these guys. All right, with that, let me start. This is not one of my 6 facts. It is a fact. I'm going to give you facts that say this man was raised from the dead. All right, let's start with the first 2, and they're pretty close together. Jesus appeared to his disciples, and in that group, somewhere right in there, he appears to James, his brother, who was a skeptic. Never a part of the apostles until after he comes the Lord. A lot of people don't realize that most of the appearances recorded to Jesus are group appearances. Keep that in mind. There's only a few appearances recorded, like James, Peter. Peter alone, by the way, it's the first one of the Creed. I just realized I did read that at the beginning there, verses 3 to 5. He appeared to Peter and then the 12, and then an appearance to James, and appearance to Paul. Now you say, well, Paul's fellows were with him. I realize that they said they didn't hear the words. There's some questions there, but about how much they heard and so on. But almost all the appearances are to groups. So when I'm not going to be doing naturalistic theories tonight, but I will tell you one. Hallucination is still maybe the most popular theory. But when I'm out on university campuses and doing this, if they come to the microphone and they say, can I give you a naturalistic theory? Oh, shoot, go ahead. I'll respond. More often than not, the one I get almost all the time? Why can't we say the disciples stole the body? Thank you for picking the worst theory of all. No scholar, you can find one or two, but virtually no scholar has held that view since Hermann Samuel Reimarus, the German rationalist philosopher, at 1763. You know why nobody uses it? Because it stinks. That's the short answer. Okay, but hallucination is popular. Let me just make one comment. Hallucination, there's not an hallucination view per se, since Jesus mostly is believed to have appeared to groups. The hallucination theory should be called the hallucination theory. Now here's my point. A lot of the guys that argue hallucination say, well, I know you guys don't believe in group hallucinations. I think I found 1 or 2 cases. I'll say, you have 1 or 2 iffy cases. Got a medical doctor friend who says he's checked all the medical sources back 25 to 50 years. There's no published case of a group hallucination. Another friend of mine, clinical psychologist, checked the sources back that far. And these things have been said in critical journals. No group hallucinations in the literature. But let's just say you know of a couple possibilities. Here's my sentence. Why is the hallucination theory popular when your theory is something like this? I know of a few cases, so this could have been an hallucination. Oh, what you mean is you know of a few examples, so don't forget it's hallucination theory, which happened to the most unique man who ever lived, the best ethical teacher, the only one who's acclaimed in all the world religions and praised, who said, what you do with me determines where you spend eternity. Even Rudolf Bultmann says that. He's respected by everybody. He appears multiple times, and your argument is, I think I got 1 or 2 cases, but you've got like 8, and happened to the guy who's unique? We're getting close to the end of the argument here. So that's a second volume in Refutations. Okay, so Jesus appears to this group of his disciples, And I'll call that fact number one. Very well backed up. Now, Ehrman again, 15 independent sources for the crucifixion. The source with the disciples, mostly groups. And about the same time, Jesus appears to his brother James. Hard to pin it down, but let me give you some possible parameters. Whether you like John, where Jesus gives his, John is asked there, and Jesus' mother's present. And Jesus gives his mom to John, and it says he took her home from that moment on. But even if you use the other Gospels, how many women went, what their names are? It's pretty clear that James was not at the cross, at least not anywhere we know. Mark 3, Mark 6, John 7, that's multiple sources, by the way, because John's always another source. After all the ones we gave, John is another source anyway, besides the miracles thing. So, James isn't there. But Mark 3 in particular, the Greek says the family thought Jesus, this is the Greek, the family thought Jesus was mentally disturbed. And the way they talk, it could be taken as some kind of schizophrenia, but that's questionable. The townspeople thought he was mentally disturbed, and the boys tried to get him out of the way, probably because they thought he was embarrassing the family. And then it happens again in chapter 6 of Mark, and John says in 7, for as yet his brothers did not believe in him. So when does James come to the Lord? It's just a guess. He's not at the cross, but when the ascension is recorded in Acts chapter 1, verse 11, we have that upper room episode that comes right after the ascension, and there's over 100 people there. And at the end of the list, in Acts 1, it says, this is a paraphrase, Mary and the boys were there. It's not like Gunslinger, it sounds like the OK Corral or something. Mary and the boys were there. James is in the house by the ascension. Doesn't seem to be in the house by the time of the crucifixion. James comes somewhere in there. How would you like to have been in on that appearance? Jesus appears, puts his hands out. The nails did not go in the palms in spite of the Greek word hand. The Greek word hand is not a real specific term. It's used of the arm several times. Scholars think the nail was put right here. It's almost unanimous, both medical doctors and New Testament scholars. So Jesus puts his hands out, and here's his wounds, minus the watches. And he says, bro, it's me. What do you do if you're James? I imagine I'd like to think it was something like Thomas. I'd like to think he falls down on his knees and grabs him. But he does believe. So the first set of two, Jesus appears to 12. Most of them are group appearances. James is next. All right, the next set of two. Within a very short time after the cross, immediately for the third one, and right after the second one is of these two, is Paul's conversion. All right. I already goofed. Paul's the first one over there. He's coming down. These two are the preaching of the resurrection. How soon was the resurrection message preached? If this is the cross, and Paul comes to the Lord at +2 or +3, remember this is only 6 years. If he comes at +2 or +3, he comes to know Christ. Told you coming up. We have a very short window here. Why was Paul so mad? The text says he was breathing out threatenings against the church. He said he wanted to destroy the church in Galatians 1. He also talks about it in Philippians. You got a lot of Acts passage comments. Paul was angry. Why was he angry? Because the preaching of the resurrection happened immediately. I mean, it should be back here, but happened immediately. Garrett Ludeman, who just passed away a couple years ago, atheist New Testament scholar, member of the Jesus Seminar. That's his word. In one of his 2 books on the resurrection, Ludeman says that the preaching of the resurrection occurred immediately, no gap. The Greek word for this early preaching is homologia. Homologia, break the word down, one word. Think of John 1:1, the word. Homologia, he says the preaching started immediately. We have a body of literature that goes out right away, atheist New Testament scholar, and the resurrection was the center of the material. So at first it was just preaching. The preaching became solidified at a fairly early date. The second of the 2 here are New Testament creeds. Let me explain creeds for you. This has nothing to do with Nicaea, Chalcedon, Apostles' Creed, still much later. In the New Testament, and this is a fairly new thing among critics, but virtually nobody disputes this. In fact, in this point, I teach a PhD course, and all we do are creeds. How much data are there? There's a bunch of them in the New Testament. Most of them are in Paul, or are what are called the Acts sermon summaries in the book of Acts. Here's an interesting question. How do we know what happened to the early church? Evangelical, read Acts. Critics, how do we know what happened in the New Testament? Read Acts. You go, oh, they agree. No, they don't. Evangelicals think the whole book is usable. Critics think the sermon summaries in Acts 1 through 5, 10, 13, and maybe 17, 1 to 5 and 10 are Petrine, and 13 and maybe 17, well, 17 is, but it depends on if it's a creed, are Pauline. And they believe these are snippets that if the apostles weren't the authors, they're dated right to the time of the apostles. But these creeds are frequently put in the 30s AD. Now, you might like Mark at 30 to 40, Matthew at plus 50, Luke 55, John 65. How do you like creeds from 2 to 3 years later? Critics say this. Okay, let me give you an example. Jesus Seminar, not friends to conservatives. They dedicate their books to several Bible critics who are very well known. They devote them to David Hume, David Strauss, Thomas Jefferson, as they say, who took scissors and paste to the Gospels. These are the guys they devote their books to. Depending on whether you use red beads or pink beads, you've got to get into how they do this. But they reject between 81 and 91% of the New Testament red letter words of Jesus. Not conservative. And yet, this creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that I paraphrased, 1 Corinthians 15, 3. Some think it only goes 3 to 5, and some think it goes all the way to verse 7. But that creed, according to the Jesus Seminar, was voted that either the creed or its component parts, which basically the same thing, the creed or its component parts were in existence before Paul set out for Damascus. Why does the New Testament say Paul was breathing out threatenings against the church? This stuff was heresy. And wait till he starts teaching what we call today high Christology. This man sitting down in the front row was one of the leaders in high Christology, David. And he's written some excellent things on how Yahweh, the name Yahweh, was applied to Jesus very, very early in the church. And I love this phrase. It's been used by a number of New Testament scholars now. The earliest Christology is the highest Christology. They used to say, I heard both Bauckham and Dunn say over lunch that we used to say John was the first time high Christology comes. 65 years later, they said we've abandoned that view. We think it occurred right here. The earliest Christology is the highest Christology. And there's a number of reasons for this. Prayer, worship passages, graffiti, archaeology, and other things going on. But the leading one are these creeds. Now, the creeds were oral. They don't start to be written until 1 Thessalonians. Some people put in 48, but usually 50 AD is 1 Thessalonians. And here's the biggest complaint about the creeds. All right, so you got these stupid little things from early on. Phone tag explains those things. You tell this person the story, by the time you get down to the sixth person down here, the story's totally goofed up. That's the creeds. How do you know they're authoritative? You can't get there. Okay, there's several ways to get there, but here's the best one. And even Bart Ehrman acknowledges the strength of this argument. In the book of Galatians, chapter 1, after Paul's conversion, he goes away for a little bit of time. He comes back, and he goes to Jerusalem and spends 15 days with Peter and James. Now, he comes back a second time in chapter 2, and he's with John. John and the other two. This is really significant because, okay, Paul's a Pharisee. He knows how to do research. And what do? You talk to the eyewitnesses. And you're already at a very early date, two important rules. So what's he do? He makes a trip to Jerusalem. He interviews Peter and James. Later, John. Bart doesn't think any eyewitnesses are the author of the four Gospels, although he acknowledges there are some other sources that need to be brought up. But Galatians is accepted by the critics. And in Galatians 1, they do think Paul went to Jerusalem. He interviews those two guys. And then later, John, in chapter 2. And he says he's specifically talking about the gospel data. How's the gospel data defined? Just read it to you, 1 Corinthians 15, or paraphrased it. Here's another one. Maybe second best known New Testament verse, second best maybe to John 3:16. Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. When the gospel data are defined in the New Testament, mostly Paul's writings in the book of Acts, those early preaching passages, this is the gospel. Deity, death, resurrection, minimum. Other things are mentioned here and there, but mostly deity, death, resurrection. Romans 10:9 has them very nicely right there. Guess what? Romans 10:9 is an early creed, and everybody acknowledges that, like Rudolf Bultmann, who's to the left of Ehrman. I don't want to say Ehrman looks like an evangelical compared to Bultmann. That's not a little bit unfair, but Bultmann didn't like any historical arguments whatsoever, and Ehrman admits a whole bunch of them. Romans 10:9, there's a great definition of the gospel, early creed. Romans 1, 3, and 4, early creed. Several passages again in Acts 1 through 5, 10, 13 for sure, maybe 17. Those are called, they're not always called creeds, but they're the same thing. They're early, what they call apostolic preaching points. And that's why they like Acts, not because they like the whole book. Okay, so these creeds are early. But how do you know it's not telephone tag? That's a tough objection. Because Paul paid the price to go to Jerusalem 3 years after he was saved. I'm getting up here to this point. But I want to finish talking about the creeds, but see already where we've come. Here's the cross. The disciples see him, mostly in groups. Here's James. Okay, the second set of two. The homologia, earliest preaching without creeds. The homologia becomes creeds. And Paul takes off for Damascus. And the Jesus Seminar, again, repeat, the Jesus Seminar thinks that creed comes in. And Paul knew about it. That's why he was so angry. And it was in existence before he left. James D.G. Dunn said in his book, Jesus Remembered, that creed became codified within months after the cross. Now, months can be a year or two or whatever, but since Jesus died in the spring, months could be the same year. And he says, within months of the cross. I told you both Bauckham and Dunn told me that their view was high Christology's down here. Toward the end of their careers, pray for Bauckham, he's having some really serious eye issues. He was blind for a while, and then he got his sight back, and it's rough, and he's trying to do a lot of writing. But Bauckham and Dunn both said that they had to revise their Christology to realize that right here, it's in full play, and the creeds. Now, nobody asked the phone tag question, but someone's going to. So what do you do with the phone tag question? Paul went there to the eyewitnesses. Bart says we have none of the Gospels. So where are they? He narrates, Bart Ehrman narrates the appearance Paul's going to Jerusalem and interviewing these two guys. And Bart says, first of all, he makes a kind of a quip that's really cute. He says, Paul went up to Jerusalem and spent 15 days with Peter and James. I'd like to go up to Jerusalem and spend 15 days with Peter and James. That's what he says. And then he says this, where do we get closer to the eyewitnesses than right here? The reason it's not phone tag is Paul went to the source and they said the same thing. How do you know? He comes back in chapter 2 and he presents the gospel that he was preaching to see if I was running or had run in vain. That's a crazy verse, Galatians 1:2. To see if I was in error, he says, they added nothing to me. And a few verses later, they give he and Barnabas, they lay hands on them and bless their ministry and say, go to the Gentiles and do this. They agreed on the gospel. Bart says we don't have eyewitnesses in the Gospels. We have eyewitnesses in Galatians 1 and 2. There's a little Greek word. Actually, it's a long Greek word. But in Galatians 1:18, the Greek word is hysteresi. The root word of hysteresi is histor. The word histor is the word where in Greek it starts with Herodotus, the father of history, hundreds of years before the church. Same thing. Herodotus tells us how we gather sources and do the same thing we do critical history. The root word is histor. And Paul uses that word to describe what he did with them in Jerusalem. Isn't that great for a Pharisee? He was checking out the material. Don't tell me they let the story go crazy in the phone tag. Paul checked it out, and they all said the same thing. A really good verse that backs this up is 1 Corinthians, right after the Creed, 1 Corinthians 15:11. Whether it's I, the apostles in this context, or it's me, so we preach and so you believe. I don't care if you get it from them. I don't care if you get it from me. We're telling the same message. That's why it's not phone tag. Okay, so it's preached here, homologia, it's solidified. Paul goes to Jerusalem, and he meets Jesus. And after his conversion, I'm already past the 6 points. 3 years later, he goes back, and that's when he meets these guys. I say Jerusalem coming here? Damascus. Sorry about that. 3 years later, he goes to Jerusalem. So the 6 are, Jesus appeared to the 12. James is in there somewhere. By the way, we have a scrap of a fragment called the Gospel of the Hebrews. There's only 3 little portions, and one of them has the appearance from Jesus to James. Now, it's a quasi-Gnostic. It's not Orthodox or anything, but Jesus appears to James and does just pretty much what I said. All right, so James. The homologia, the earliest preaching, is codified in creeds, agreed by critics. Peter goes and gets the message himself, and he goes up. He's converted, and 3 years later, he goes up, and that's the 6 years. That's all 6 years here. Gospel appearances are immediate. The creeds, 2 or 3. When Paul goes here, this alone is only 2 or 3 years later, depending on how you date Paul. Doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative. Agreement there. And 3 years later. So 3 plus 3 is 6, 2 plus 3 is 5. So it's either 35 AD or 36 AD. We have the gospel. It's backed up. It's by eyewitnesses. And the critics accept this stuff. That doesn't mean they believe the resurrection. But I think it means they've admitted the material and they don't have a leg to stand on. So these are I use 6 minimal facts. They're all here. Now I have a larger list of 12, and then I shorten the list to 6, and these are the 6. We're going to make the list available to you folks here. You can get them. You can get the PowerPoint. I've got a PowerPoint. I don't use it because I'm not going to keep pushing buttons while I'm walking back and forth. So if you're interested, we can send you the PowerPoint. But this is it. Within 5 to 6 years, we have the early material is totally turned around New Testament Christology. Then guys like this comes along and say, you know what? They called Paul Yahweh. They used the word for Yahweh. What? And the Germans thought his book was so good. It was published in the Wundt set, W&T, the German monographs. That was your dissertation, wasn't it? Dissertation. And it's on Yahweh being applied to Jesus. Don't tell me they didn't have early Christology back here. John didn't even run around calling Jesus Yahweh. So it's right here. Now maybe you'll know some verses where John did that. You can correct me. But this is a great argument. It's historical. People can deny it. Denying it doesn't disprove it. I don't know how you would go after this if you want to disprove it. I don't know what you do with it. My time is up. I was told stop at 8, and my watch says it's 8.
On the hallucination theory, aren't hallucinations most often associated with mental illness? If so, is there evidence the noted witnesses were mentally ill?
If they mean the gospel, if they mean the disciples, I would say no. But I co-authored an article years ago for the Irish Theological Quarterly, respected journal. I wrote it with a medical doctor, and he and I had a disagreement about this. Now, he's a medical doctor. He said, Gary keeps talking about hallucinations if normal people can have them. That's not normally true. He said, in my profession, they're almost always mentally ill. And that's what he says in this article. And I just said, well, okay, so maybe a lot of them are mentally ill, but maybe a lot of them aren't. But I don't take that view, but I'm not a medical doctor. So
yeah, I think that there's probably a good number of them in modern times that are eating mushrooms also.
Well, that's called the shroom theory of the resurrection. Hey, by the way, I just got this one from a scholar the other day. He said, this person is asking me, I did something on the resurrection, they're asking about the shroom theory, can you help me? And we're answering. But the gal who wrote the article said, the objection said, hey, you can eat mushrooms and have those experiences. Well, first of all, you got to prove they were eating mushrooms. You got to prove all of them were eating mushrooms. I don't think Paul was eating mushrooms. He wasn't in the group. I don't think James was eating mushrooms. He wasn't in the group. And even if you eat mushrooms, A, you don't necessarily have experiences. B, you don't have the same experience. So the theory is just, if you live through the 60s, you can say anything. But I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever on the resurrection.
All right. Do foreign, non-Western students have different questions about the resurrection?
Got a lot of non-Western students in our PhD program. And if I'm recalling them correctly, I don't remember them having different ones. I think that's a fair question. But no, I can't say they're much different. Not the ones I've had.
I got a text message today from a friend, Jeremiah Johnston, who said, I'm supposed to ask you about the Shroud of Turin.
Jeremy's a good friend. Notice I don't call him Jeremiah. That's because I've known him for about 40 years. He was a little kid. He was Jeremy. And he said, keep calling me Jeremy. I like it. Okay. By the way, he is one of 2 guys editing my 4th volume that goes in this Thursday. Ask him about the Shroud. I don't know what he wants me to say. He's doing some Shroud stuff right now. I think the Shroud is a very possible evidence for the resurrection. I don't think it compares to the historical data. Now, I've co-authored 2 books on the shroud, and I say that to tell you that my co-author was one of the scientists who did the 78 investigation, Ken Stevenson, a professor at the famous Air Force Academy carpool that started the shroud studies, the modern version of it. And I do a fair number of interviews on this, and people, the shroud crowd, I said today to some of the people who were there this morning, the shroud crowd doesn't like me saying this, but when they ask me how sure I am about the shroud, I'll go, depends on what side of the bed I got up on. And then I tell them I don't sleep in a bed anyway, so it depends on what side of the chair I got up on. And if I'm in a good mood or not, and if the fish are biting, because I live on a little lake, that will make me feel better about the shroud if I catch a big bass. Okay, and they just joke around. I would put my shroud insurance, my assurance at about 80%. I think it could be. Problem with the shroud is that a theory could falsify the shroud. People have handed in their cases and they haven't been able to do it. But at any time, somebody could falsify it, and we'd have to. That's how inductive science goes. So.
All right. How do you respond to people who say, I see all the historical evidence you've given, but I don't believe resurrection is physically possible?
Boy, do I like to hear from those people. Here's my first comment. I want to know if they're a naturalist or any materialist, any species. They might even say, I don't study philosophy, so I don't know. But if your view is that all there is materialism or naturalism, I'd say, you know what? I have an appendix on this in one of the 2 books. My argument is you can't prove naturalism. There's no argument that proves naturalism. And so the problem with what you're doing here is that I'm giving you evidences from 6 years, everything early, everything that meets all the standards of scholarship, and you're throwing something out there, hey, resurrections don't happen, on your view, which is not grounded. There's no way to prove it. And now, I will say this, and I've already told one of the groups here this week, Anthony Flew, who became a very good friend of mine, we debated on the resurrection 3 times. He's the best-known philosophical atheist in the world. By the way, he's apparently written more, if anybody knows more examples, I'd like to know this, but he's apparently written more, he died in 2010, but he apparently wrote more pro-atheist literature than anybody else who ever lived. So he has an objection that I think would stump most Christians, and it's called the natural miracle objection. And it goes like this. Well, I think hallucinations are the best, and Christians are all ready for it. You can't see hallucinations in groups. Not going to happen. And Tony said, and you're not going to see resurrections either. So, group hallucinations might be very, very rare, or we still may be looking for one, but I don't think we're going to find another resurrection. That's his natural miracle objection. Anyway, we debated 3 times. He never used that objection, and he even admitted that groups don't see hallucinations. So I think that comes in different forms. But when you have groups of hallucinations, first of all, you might find a few, if there are any. Dale Allison has produced a few, although Dale's a friend of mine, but he messes things up. He puts hallucinations, illusions, and delusions together and calls them hallucinations. You can't do that. Delusions are medical. They're psychiatric. Illusions are when you see a grizzly bear out in the woods and you think for all your life that he's Sasquatch, but you weren't seeing hallucination. And they'll say, see, he saw an hallucination. No, he didn't. He saw an illusion. He really saw a grizzly bear. Calls it that. Those don't count. You have to. The definition of an hallucination is you see something for which there's no external referent. That's rare and radical. And they often use group kinds. Like 3 of us hunters saw this Sasquatch. No, 3 of you hunters found a grizzly bear. And when they go find the tracks, So I think there's guys coming back with those things, but I think they're not, those views aren't going to work either.
All right, next question. How does Islam deal with the evidence for the resurrection?
Islam has almost 100 verses in the Quran on Isa, or Jesus. And the Quran says loftier things about Jesus than it does about Muhammad, with one exception. Muhammad is the chief prophet of Allah, and Jesus is next. That's the greatest, but they don't have miracles. There are debates, interestingly, between Muslims and Muslims about whether the Quran has miracles, and the general feeling is there are no miracles in the Quran. So, and when Muhammad asks Jesus, a God, can you give me a miracle so that they know I'm a prophet, God says no. Pretty bad. And if we have these things here, now they say, the loftier things they say Isa was born of a virgin, he was sinless, he did miracles, and he's the Messiah. All that's in the Quran, so they're very kind. But I don't think they're really going to get involved. I'm just guessing. If they want to get involved, they can get involved. But I don't think they're going to get involved in this debate, but they don't have the miracles. And if they go to Hadith, that's why nobody accepts the same Hadith. They say the Hadith is like 70 years later. It's actually stretched out for centuries. By the way, Nabil Qureshi was a friend of mine. I knew him for 2 years when he was a Muslim. Now, I'm not saying I was part of his conversion. David Wood and Mike Licona were much closer to him. But he brought his father to a dialogue. He said his father was the sharpest guy he ever knew. And his father, we started a meeting at Mike's house. Mike Licona, Mike said, let's open this meeting in prayer. And he asked Nabil's fathers to pray, which is kind of interesting. So he prays. And in the dialogue, his father said, do you know anything about the Shroud of Turin? Because the man in the shroud is not dead. I'm thinking, oh my gosh. Yeah, I know a little bit. I've written 2 books, and my co-author is one of the scientists that did the investigation. Nobody thinks that. There's at least 6 evidences the man in the shroud is dead, and I gave him all 6 evidences, and he dropped his complaint. But they will often cite the shroud for Jesus being alive. And the man has postmodern blood flow, separation of blood and serum. He's in a state of rigor mortis. You can see it on the image several times, and rigor mortis is really hard to fake. So, I mean, he's dead. But I don't think, they might call us heretics, or they might say things like that, but I don't think they're going to dispute with data. And if they do, I think it's going to be from the Hadith, and the Hadith goes all the way up, I'm told, better scholars than me, to the 11th to 12th century AD. It's not 70 years after Muhammad.
Were the first eyewitnesses, the women at the tomb, ever interviewed by Paul or gospel writers?
Could have. Makes sense. Luke said he interviewed a bunch of the eyewitnesses. He could have. You know why I think that's a very reliable text? Here's how New Testament guys get in and do data. The gospel writers were all around the Mediterranean. Mark is supposed to have written from Rome, John from Ephesus. There's a lot of room between Rome and Ephesus. These guys were not 4 guys on a block that wrote the same view. But they all have the women going to the tomb first. Now, the men went to the tomb too. That's recorded in Luke and in John. You could start your gospel and say the men went there, and you're telling the truth. You're just leaving out the earlier part of the story. They didn't do that. They all told the story of the women going to the tomb, which gets you in hot water if you're doing evidence. Because it's not that just the Jews. A gal named Carolyn Osiek published a really influential article and said all the people around the Mediterranean had that same view of the women that the Jews did. And if you have that kind of a thesis, but you insist, 4 out of 4 from different locations, and you go, well, yeah, but they could have used each other, right? Didn't they all use Mark, or didn't 2 of them use Mark? Yeah, but the trips to the tomb are different. If you read them, they look like, scholars say that there's between 3 and 4 sources in those 4 gospel deals. They don't copy. So I think it takes a lot to say the women went there. And here's the reason. It's what happened. One more evidence for the shroud, the Gospels being historical.
Yeah, I know that we get into issues of dating of the Gospels and order of the Gospels and what we rely on from the Gospels. But you mentioned how Luke says that he did the interviewing. You see evidence of that within Luke. Luke is the only one who has the Mary pregnancy story in the way he tells the Mary pregnancy story. He would have gotten it from Mary. while a lot of men and women did not intermingle, if Luke was in fact a doctor, he would have treated women. He would have been in a position to intermingle, to talk to them, to talk about personal details, to do that kind of stuff. And then you've also got something very interesting that I don't know if you've spoken on this or if some of the other scholars have, but you read 1 Corinthians, which you've been referencing, and when Paul writes in 1 Corinthians about the Lord's Supper, he says, for I, delivered to you, and he uses the exact same Greek wording that Luke uses. I mean, in Greek, you don't just reverse translate. I mean, word order, word forms, it's clearly, and this is something written early, it's clearly something that's there as well. I don't have you.
It's 1 Corinthians is another one of the creeds, too. I gave you what I was given.
Yeah.
Paul says it's not my material. Yeah. But he does read, it reads the closest. Luke and Paul are the closest, not the other Gospels.
Right. Okay, a lot of these are the same. I think we've got time for one more. And it depends on your answer to my first question before I decide if it's this one. Do you know anything about hockey?
I tried. I was the head ice hockey coach at Liberty for 9 years.
Okay, then I'm going to read it to you.
And we were ranked in the nation that first year. And here's one for you. My first game, Liberty. They didn't know if to wear helmets that first year because we weren't in a league. So all my guys went out there without helmets. I had about 6 guys on my team who'd rather fight than play hockey. One of them was 6'6", 220 pounds. I'm telling you, he did not have 1 inch of fat on his body. And he had this little challenge sentence he used. He'd say to somebody who was picking on our goalie, he'd say, if you want to dance, why don't you come over here and dance with me? And one referee kicked him up for saying that. He went to the penalty box, and the referee said, on second thought, get out of the game. Stupidly, the referee let him skate all the way to the end of the ice by himself, and the guy he challenged came skating down after him. The guy was a professional fighter, and the 6'6" guy knocked the tar out of him. And I thought to myself, someone's going to the hospital, and I don't think I'm going to be coaching anymore. But it worked out, and that cemented me with those guys in the first game because they were willing to, oh, by the way, in that game, one of the guys on the other team beat the referee up, 6-inch cut in his hair.
Well, I'm sure he showed him the love of Jesus at the same time. I will read this question based on that.
All right.
As a hockey player come apologist, how eager were you to charge into the corners, and how often did you emerge with the puck?
In hockey or in apologetics?
I'm suspecting that it was, that's a metaphor for apologetics.
I probably shouldn't say it, but I was one of the guys that liked to mess my fists up. I got 6 stitches across here because I got in a fight and pounded the guy a little bit. And had to go to the hospital and get stitches. It happens.
Well,
sometimes you're defending other people when you're fighting too.
Hey, Peter pulled the sword before he was told to put it up.
And he cut off the ear.
Yeah,
that's
an
nasty.
indication he was probably left-handed too, if you're looking at the ear.
And so am I, so that's fantastic.
Okay, well, you and The Rock. I tell you, we've got a lot of really good questions, and I think we've run out of time. But I do want to thank you for these. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but it's hard to beat hockey, and I don't want to get hit by this taking too long. And so let's close with a word of prayer, and then you can join me in thanking our guests tonight. Lord, we do thank you for Dr. Habermas, and we thank you for this evening. We thank you for a lifetime devoted to study. We pray that hearts will be tender when we talk to people about Jesus. We pray that your Spirit will be convicting when we talk to people about Jesus. And we pray that we will do it with confidence in the reality of your resurrection of Jesus Christ. We pray these things in his name. Amen. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Habermas?